rasilimali katika nchi zinazoendelea ziwe ni endelevu na zisichangie migogoro.
Asante sana Dr. Mimi nikutakie mkutano mwema.
Asante, kila la heri.
Asante sana.
Mlete na Jeni bwana, tuchukue picha. Tuchukue kwanza. Sasa wewe utakuwa Juma kesho kutwa?
Ndio.
Utakuja? Take a pic for us and then you'll join us.
Okay. Naomba nipige picha na mwalimu wangu.
Sawa. Na wewe pia utupige picha. Njoje. Meeting again. Can you imagine? Gosh. Sasa je, I wanted to tell you. Text.
I'm coming from the Chinese embassy.
Okay.
So you are working for the ESRF?
Yes.
ESRF.
Yes.
Like recently, we want to pay a visit to your institute.
Oh, that's good.
Because our leader, Minister Counselor,
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. How many panelists do we have? Oh yeah, they have microphone. I needed two. And then how many panelists do we have right now? Why do we have 6? Do you know who did this? We don't need an extra chair. We don't need an extra. Who was? Yeah, we should have 4 mics. Let me see. Where are they? Where are the? Yeah. Oh, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 people.
Yes.
Just chair. Who's dealing with the chair? Sasa, nimeweka viti 6 hivi 5 for this session. Naomba nitie nani anakuwa anashughulikia? Naomba niitie kwa nimalize.
Kuna maswali yataulizwa kutoka kwenye tweet.
Mimi nashughulikia, yes. Niitie yule alikuwa anashughulika na hivi viti. Na
Habari za kushinda.
Safi tu, habari yako?
salama tu. Unaendeleaje?
Safi kabisa. This is nice. When you are sharing things, I always enjoy.
You always enjoy.
Hongera sana.
Asante sana. Doctor,
How are you, sir?
habari za siku nyingi.
Salama jamani daktari.
Unaendeleaje?
Nakusalimia Profesa Ndo.
Sawa sawa. Jana sasa hivi. I'm all right. Just Hello, hello, hello. Hello. I know it's a time to take selfies and take pictures. If you could please have our seats. Otherwise, lunch will be delayed. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, if I can have the... Thank you. Our three professors, Professor Stiglitz, Professor Kaushik, Professor Sabrina. Huh. Microphone. No? Oh, okay. Anybody see spectacles on your table that don't belong to you, or that you're not? So where is... this is what will happen now while we wait for our three professors to show up. I didn't know you could disappear in such a... suddenly. It's quite interesting. I should learn, I should finish this. I was going to do it just before lunch. Josephine, can you look for our three professors, please? Let's try and locate them. I need to learn this disappearing trick. I may need it one day. Especially when I make my wife angry and I have to run away from her. It might come in handy. Yeah. So what will happen is this. Professor Mkenda is going to moderate a panel discussion, ask a session, based on what we heard earlier on. We'll open it up to the floor for questions, and we'll be going around with a microphone. And then there'll be some questions on Twitter, for those who are outside or those who tweeted with a question, because I have a feeling that the time we have till lunchtime may not be enough. So you could also do it on Twitter for that. And as you ask your questions, please, we kindly request you to be brief and get to the point and not give us a history lesson or an economics lesson or a mathematics lesson. Oh, here they are. And so that we give a chance to everybody else to also say something. You found one. Oh, Eureka! Oh, finally, well, we were debating here, you know, this wonderful disappearing trick and whether you could teach us how. So this goes here. So I'll leave this mic to share between the two of you and that one between them.
Okay, thank you very much. I was planning my own exit when I saw that I was left all by myself here. But welcome back. Now we are going to have general discussions and questions. As George has indicated, please let's not just beat around the big bush. Let's go straight to the point so that we have as many contributions as possible. So before even I try to interject with my own questions, I'll invite comments, questions from the floor. Professor Wangwe. Somebody should be running around with the mic.
Yeah, thank you very much. These were great interventions, and I cannot say more. I have only two questions I would request a bit of elaboration. First, you mentioned how we move from the Washington consensus toward the statement. There is a development in between there in 1999 and Wolferson of the Comprehensive Development Framework, which I think was a big progress beyond the Washington consensus, but somehow it didn't pick up after going into PRSPs. We are not sure where it ended. Would you wish to link it up with that development over time so we can bring it on board? Secondly, it's very impressive to see the state, market, and community. You have nicely put the role of community in terms of civil society as through checks and balances and so on. There are two other issues which I would have expected to come up. One is the role of local communities in correcting for failures, government failures, and market failures. So the communities come in. But second is the role of communities in producing local public goods, which government cannot, the private sector cannot. So I thought those two roles, if you can comment on them also as part of that complementarity between state, markets, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wangwe. Next, I think, just next to Professor Wangwe there, I can see a hand. All right, whoever is nearer you. Unfortunately, you are not nearer to her, so she's over there.
Thank you. My name is Barwani Mshale from Twaweza, East Africa. I am also delighted to see that economists are actually recognizing the role of the market, the state, and the community and trying to strike a balance between these three entities. But my question to the panelists, and especially since you are economists, is how do we draw the line to distinguish what is market, what is the state, and what is the community? Because there are some linkages there are some interactions there. Some of the civil society, for instance, one can argue that they have been captured by the state or they have been captured by the private sector. Some of the local communities, the non-government organizations, one can question to what extent non-government organizations are actually non-governmental because of the relationships, the dependencies and interdependencies that exist between them. And when it comes to economics analysis, one would wish to see clear boundaries between these. So how do you grapple with this articulation of how you draw a line between what is the market, what is the state, and what can be labeled as a community entity?
Toloda, we move just there, one person, then we come here and there, and then I think we'll get some questions from the Twitter.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jelas Chirove from ILO, International Labour Organization. Last week I was in Uganda, not really for a discussion on Stockholm Statement, but for a validation of a study on the analysis of the growth pattern in Uganda and why it has not resulted in a requisite employment creation. And the findings from that study were very much similar to the principles of the Stockholm Statement on issues related to growth and lack of inclusivity, issues of functioning of the market and so on. So my question is to maybe the founders of the Stockholm Statement, what plans do you have to have this kind of dialogue to take this kind of dialogue to other countries as well? Because you will find a kind of the same or similar phenomena in other countries, apart from Tanzania, for example.
Thank you. The mic can come up front here, please. And then there, while you are coming, I think you can go for a lady. Over there. A lady, a lady, a lady.
Can I speak? Professor Mukanda? Is that okay?
You can't say okay. Okay, here.
Okay. Go on.
Thank you. My name is Priska Mgomberi. I'm from the UNCDF. My question is around measurement of poverty. That's multidimensional measurement of poverty. I'm happy that we have that measurement, but again, from the presentation, have noticed that only one African country is using that measurement. So what about other African countries? That's the first one. The other one is around using of those of the information collected either by multidimensional or any other measurement. How do we make sure that now we are moving towards measuring poverty using multidimensional? How do we make sure that the information is going to be used to make to inform decision, including policy and other decisions? Thank you.
Okay, while at it, I hope Professor Alkea will try to explain a little bit more also about the choice of variables that you put in MPI and how objectively they are chosen, and maybe whether it is always necessary to aggregate everything into single index, or maybe sometimes it's okay just to have a collection of information that is used for evaluation. Yutaka?
Yes, I'm just standing here, just in case. Thank you very much. My name is Yutaka Yoshino. I'm lead economist with the World Bank Country Office in Tanzania. I'm actually standing here, sorry. Thank you very much, Professors Basu, Alkaya, and also Professor Stiglitz on very inspiring presentations. My question is actually the two things that I see, two big elephants in the room that you didn't necessarily touch upon explicitly in your presentation in the context of inclusive growth. And one is population growth, and the second one is informality. The population growth, as you know, Tanzania has a quite high population growth rate of over 3%. Total fertility rate is 5.2. And certainly, you know, we see a situation where, you know, the poverty level and then fertility rate are quite correlated in terms of the household level. So the poorer the households are, the more children they have. So you cannot really address poverty without also thinking about the implication of population growth. And Tanzania is still pre-dividend country when it comes to you know, demographic transition. So what do you see the role of, you know, population and the demographic dynamics in the context of inclusive growth? And the second one is the informality. So there's one paper which came out from IMF last year, which indirectly measures the size of informality in the economy. And Tanzania came out as the second largest informal economy in Africa after Nigeria. So that estimation is over 50% of GDP is in fact coming from the informal sector. And if we also count the number of jobs, over 80% of jobs are actually non-wage jobs, meaning that they are outside of the formal labor market. So how do you see the role of informality in promoting more inclusive growth in the context of Tanzania or elsewhere in the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the population, and we'll have two more before the discussion, there and here. But on the population, Professor Stiglitz, at the University of Dar es Salaam, you did mention high population growth as one of the issues we need to look at. And I want to extend what Yutaka was saying. Will you treat high fertility as an endogenous process that is influenced by poverty itself, and the other variables, or an exogenous variable that you can deal with it separately, whether you go and attack the fertility directly? Yeah. So, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Kagbo. I'm the NIDO representative here in Tanzania. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for your presentation. I know that 2 years ago you were in Vienna and you had a very influencing comment on those new mandate of inclusive and sustainable industrial development. However, I would like you to give perhaps a few more comments on the resurgence of industrial policy, and in the context of Tanzania, given the importance that industrialization is given in government plans, how far do you think this will perhaps in many ways help to drive what we are talking about, inclusive growth in general, and for that matter, human development? On the coordination issues, and linked to that also industrial policy, there was a lot of emphasis on coordination. To what extent do you see also, perhaps also for the specific case of Tanzania, that policy consistency becomes a real challenge? It's about coordination, but to what extent consistency over time is really crucial, and linked to that, policy coherence between different sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. So the last one for the first round, and
there
then we'll
is
come
one
again.
here, Professor Kenda. He's been waving his hand for a very, very long time.
Which one?
I have two questions. For Professor Basu, how can we have a fair coordination of policies while we are competing? I think you have read a book written by Ian who says that, the title of the book is Every Nation for Itself. I think if you take that into consideration, let us see how the coordination of policies can be. My second question goes to Professor Joseph Stiglitz. I've been reading your books. I'm not an economist, but I like you because you are people-centered. And when I go around in the world, when I go to the bookshop, I must first see the new book you have written. So, in your book, you titled it Making Globalization Work. You mentioned about multinational companies, and you gave good examples, how powerful they are. And in Tanzania, we are working with many multinationals. And somewhere you indicate the ethical concerns about these multinationals, particularly on environmental conservation. And when you read the other books of yours, you focus on 1% of US, 1% of the rich people in the United States of America. And you always, you are very fair, really, if you compare with the other writers. You are very fair when you tell them where they are good and where they are not good. The challenge we are facing about multinationals operating in this country, very minimal, if at all, is there. Indigenous shareholders in those multinationals. That's why our economy is not moving. In your country, if you read books written by Robert Reich, I like him too. You think about job creation. The 1% is also thinking about job creation. But when the 1% is here in Tanzania, they don't think about job creation for social impact, for transformation of the economy of Tanzania. How can we, as Tanzania, create our indigenous 1% that will also have a social concern? Thank you.
Okay, so if we all think of making our country great again, will there be an invisible hand to coordinate? Yes.
Okay, my name is Fitsum Abraha, Economic Advisor, UNDP. My question is directed to Professor Joseph. I agree with the balance between the government's role, the markets, and the community. The challenge we see in practice is now overcrowding the private sector by the state and the community representatives such as CSOs, the media, through introducing punitive regulatory environment. How can we ensure the balance between the three bodies? And where is the limit of the role of the government? Because it dominates the political sphere, and again, it tries to dominate the economic and social sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we first have a first round of, maybe one last, at the corner over there, please.
And there are two questions from Twitter.
and then we'll listen from the Twitter, and then you'll have time to respond. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stillman. I'm also from UNCDF, where the only other woman to ask a question was from. But I would ask Professor Alkire, what are the limitations of indicators, and how far can they go, basically? Thank you.
Thank you. This will be an entire lecture. Thank you. So can we start with George? Maybe
Right.
one, two? Yeah.
So there are two questions from Twitter. One is from Oscar, which says, what is acceptable level of inequality in a country, semicolon, the world? So that's the first question on Twitter. The other one comes from CEDA headquarters. And CEDA headquarters is asking, how can we improve the resilience of low-income countries towards global financial crisis, turbulence? And the other part asks, what is the role of regional integration, trade, and institutions in this, in the above? So those are the three Twitter questions for now.
Thank you very much, George. I think we have enough on our plates. Can I start with you, Professor Basu?
Thank you. I'll take on the questions depending on the ones for which I have a reasonable answer and leave the rest to the harder ones for the others. So the first one, Professor Wangwei, on the Washington Consensus, other works like comprehensive development. At one level, when we were working on the Stockholm Statement, we were, of course, going last has the advantage that you're picking up on some of those, and you will see elements of the Washington Consensus also in there. But there were a couple of things where I think we stand out, where others have not made it as forcefully, is with the rise of behavioral economics, we were much more aware of the role of human psychology, social norms, and we stress that the same economic policies in a country with a certain set of norms could backfire, whereas it could succeed in another, and you have to be sensitive to that. We also pay attention to policy coordination across countries, because in such a globalized world today, it is very difficult for an individual country to do all the things that you want to do for your own country. So those were the new elements we were bringing in. And you also mentioned the local public goods. Our stress on the community over and above the state and the markets is precisely because there is something called a local public good, which the community is very often much more aware of and can take on that challenge, which very often goes unaddressed in the big debate of, originally it was just markets, later on it became markets and states, but there is something where you need to go further down to address, and we were talking about that. The question about where do you draw the line and can the state be captured by the private sector? The answer is, of course, yes. The state can be captured by the private sector, and that is the term crony capitalism is exactly that. And that is a very, very big risk, and I should point out that very often the term crony capitalism is treated as capitalism's risk. But you know, socialist governments can be captured also by private hands and can end up as crony capitalist systems. We've seen this happen in countries. So the capture by the private sector is a risk, and we have to remember that today there are private sector firms that match and actually exceed in power and size many small countries in the world. So indeed, that's a big challenge. You know, one particular topic which used to be very fashionable and still is important, public-private partnership. When I used to work in India, that was a very, very important theme. But I remember when you look into the details, you realize that it's important, but you have to be very careful of how you write down the contract between the public and the private in doing the same job. Otherwise, public-private partnership is a bit like putting a lion and a sheep together inside a cage. And you know that one pea is going to eat up another pea. So you need to structure the legalities of this very carefully so that the two can work together. So indeed, these are challenges that we have to be aware of. The question from ILO on how do we take the dialogue further forward that you were asking. On this, I have to say that Finn Tarp, who's here in the audience, has, as heading WIDA, played a very major role, first of all, in developing the Stockholm Statement itself because of his own work in foreign aid and poverty reduction, but subsequently in getting it translated into multiple languages, making it available around the world. So some effort has been made, but the whole purpose of a statement like this is the communication is extremely important, because at one level it's a very brief statement, just a reminder of a couple of symbolic things that we should be aware of. It is the communication which is critical. Some effort has been made, but we are continuing to do so. I'll skip over, let me get to Yotaka's question about population and demography. Indeed, this is a big challenge for entire sub-Saharan Africa, because we've seen the early countries that got the demographic dividend actually made a huge benefit out of that. Ireland was one of the early countries that benefited a lot from the demographic dividend. China's benefited. India is midway through in the demographic dividend, is benefiting with risks. But the latecomers have a big challenge, because as the demand for labor begins to shrink because of technology, as you are bringing in more working age population into your market, it is a big challenge. And this is a challenge that Tanzania will have to face in a big way. We know this from some numbers. Right now, into Tanzanian labor force, there are 800,000 new entrants every year. So close to 1 million people are coming into this. I don't know the figure for Tanzania, but youth unemployment is very high in a large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I know in Ethiopia, urban youth unemployment is 23%. So about 1/4 of the urban youth is unemployed. This is a challenge that can easily translate from an economic problem into a social and political problem and problem of conflict. So you have to pay a lot of attention. And Professor Stiglitz's talk, even the previous one in the university, attends to a lot of this challenge and what you do about this. But all I can say, this is not the forum to get into the details, but this should be in the forefront, and we have to pay attention to that. I'm just taking on, with coordination of policy, you are stressing that consistency and coherence is important, and I will just simply endorse that. Very often, it's a risk with any government, with any international organization. You undertake one policy, and then 2 years later, another policy conflicts with that. So the consistency is indeed important as coordination. Let me just take on one more, and I'm going to leave it to others to take on more. Fair coordination, is that possible while competing? It's a very, very good question, that can a group of countries or firms that are competing also coordinate? Well, a good reminder is private sector firms. They have been very good at coordinating and colluding. The reason why the Sherman Act in the United States became a law in 1890 was a realization that these firms which are in principle competing also very soon learn that we can collude and do much better. But if collusion could have come out of the motive of profit maximization, what we are stressing here, and the Stockholm Statement does that, is that collusion is needed for people who are not profit maximizing but trying to maximize human welfare. They can also collude and do better, not for profits, but for human welfare. So indeed, that's a challenge, but we've learned from the private sector that it can be overcome. So it can be overcome even for the good motivation of spreading human welfare. Let me stop with that. I know I've missed on a couple of things, but there are others to take on.
Thank you very much, Professor Basu. Professor Alkaya, I think you have a handful.
Thank you so much. So I will take on in 5 different groups. First, just a little footnote to the population growth question. We published a study this year of reduction in multidimensional poverty in Saharan African countries, and 30 of them had statistically significant reductions, really quite significant, Tanzania included. But if you look not at the rate of poverty, but the number of poor people, in 18 of those countries, the number of poor people had gone up. And so for budget reasons, you think poverty is going down, I need to spend less money on it. But when the numbers are going up, you have to report both. And so keeping both very much in the public eye perhaps is one way, a very small way, of also contributing to that discussion. In terms of the UNCDF question on the number of African MPIs, that's very much a growing industry. So it's one of the areas of a lot of work that's not yet been launched, but is underway very actively, partly because reporting an MPI fulfills the SDG indicator 1.2.2, and it advances target 1.2, the second of the 169 targets of the SDGs, which is focused on poverty in all its dimensions. And so many governments are now making them, but also for policy reasons. So in our network, I think most of the measures that will be released this year will be from Africa. So it's a beautiful time, because it's a time when the first measures are watched by everybody else, and everyone else wants to learn. So it's a very dynamic and innovative time. In terms of the variables, which both you asked and the other UNCDF person, and also your question, about the choice of variables. So countries do it differently depending on their context and the space for civil engagement. In some, as I mentioned, El Salvador, there's 2 years of UND-supported participatory work that really listens to the protagonists of poverty. Others have already had Voices of the Poor or participatory studies, and so the NGOs, the experts, bring that information to it. In Chile, for example, that happened. Some countries want to come with something, but having a long back computation, so they're very restricted by the survey. So, for example, Pakistan released with 11 years of back computations, but it meant they could really only look at the variables that were present in the survey. So each context is a little different, but it tends to reflect the national plan, the constitution. In Mexico, the social law of development, participatory exercises in the combination that's feasible for the time and budget of the country. In terms of the limits of the variables, it's no magic bullet. I mean, there will be things that are hard to measure that don't go in, like humiliation or empowerment. Often the measures are household, so they don't get at the gendered aspects. They can all be age disaggregated, but maybe early childhood development is missing. So there are different ways of compensating the measures that different governments do by basically going deeper for certain population subsets. The other linked question was about indicators. And every single official national MPI in Latin America, except Mexico, has work or employment, particularly informality and better quality of job in their national MPI. So that's been a very strong voice from that region, saying that needs to be part of the convention. Finally, moving to the use of information, how do you get political buy-in? This is something where statisticians and economists are learning to talk with other actors. And from observing the network that I mentioned that you are part of, somebody has to be passionate about poverty reduction, somebody with policy leverage. It could be a statistician, as in the case of South Africa with Dr. Palilohola. It could be, or Palilohola. It could be the head of state, as in many of the countries we work in, or the vice president, or a minister. But if somebody has that ability, that leadership and ability to drive action through and galvanize a collusion that's very positive, then that's important. And so the process of developing the MPI also has to be that process of figuring out who will take it forward. If it's just launched and nobody does anything, it doesn't serve the poor. So it's a lost opportunity. And the final thing is on something totally different, which is the Stockholm Statement. And I've had the joy of also studying how economic ideas change. And if you think not of the rise of the Washington Consensus, which is so well known and documented, but going back the rise of free market economics against socialism, there was a combination of personal experience of von Hayek and others of hyperinflation. There was a combination of engaging the secondhand traders of ideas in the media, in intellectuals, and there was moving money to found a foundation for economic education, which changed how economics was taught, FEE. There was layers of policy engagement, and where the Institute of Economic Action or different institutions went forward. So I think this is a question now in the age of social media, and here in this context of not only how do we support the Stockholm Statement or the Dar es Salaam Statement, but how...
Much for a wide range of interesting questions. And let me plunge into the middle. One of the tools, instruments of government developing states that was very influential and very criticized in the Washington Consensus, but is now being brought back into the discussion here in Tanzania, is industrial policies. And in general, the term industrial policies doesn't mean necessarily promoting industry. It's just government policies to promote sectors that are different from what the market would. So we use the term industrial policies, for instance, to describe what Ethiopia has done in promoting horticulture, for instance, which is a very high value-added, employment-intensive industry. In the United States, we had a very poorly designed industrial policy where we promoted the financialization of the economy and derivatives, where we gave derivatives preferential treatment, for instance, with respect to the bankruptcy laws. Every other civilized society says when you go bankrupt, the first claimant is workers. But the United States changed the law to say the first claimant were the derivatives. It was done secretly without people really knowing what was done in the legislation, but it was an industrial policy hidden in the legislative framework. So as we think about industrial policy, there are 3 points. One, that it's broader than in terms of the sectors. Secondly, it's broader in terms of objectives. We worry about climate change, employment, inclusivity, all aspects of industrial policy that are different today than it was before. There are a whole variety of instruments that we have for promoting industrial policies. When we come then to the actual implementation of the industrial policies, the question is, it's really difficult to, I mean, it should be a subject of a national debate. What is the right interventions in the market? Because that's really difficult. It has to do with potential for learning, identification of market failures in the way I talked about before. So one of the questions now, as I understand it, facing Tanzania is should it go back to, to what extent should it be promoting manufacturing? And I gave a talk on Monday at University of Dar es Salaam where I pointed out that the export-led, manufacturing export-led model of growth that was at the center of the success of East Asia is not going to work for Africa. Not because there aren't some jobs that could be achieved, that can play some role, but the overall productivity growth globally in manufacturing has so exceeded the growth in demand that global employment in manufacturing is going down. So that given the demographic growth that was referred to, not just in Tanzania, but in Africa more generally, even if all the jobs in manufacturing left China, it would make only a small dent in employment in Africa. So it can play a role, but one has to recognize it won't play the same role that it played in East Asia. Trying to explain this idea that what worked in one period may not work in another is really difficult. A lot of us have been trying to explain to Trump that going back, trying to revive the coal mining industry or the steel industry is not going to be the basis for future U.S. economic growth. It just isn't going to work. He's not a very good student. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the change in global economics, the sectors of the future are going to be in the service sectors. And one want to look what are the dynamic learning service sector. In the United States, just as one example, there are more people who are professional athletes than there are miners and all other extractive industries put together. So it just, or to give you another number, he's been worrying about the decline in coal miners. There are only about 50,000 coal miners in the whole country. The number of jobs in installation of solar panels is 5 times the number of coal miners. And so when he tried to restrict the importation of solar panels, he was hurting far more people and the environment than he was saving in the coal mining industry. So you can't look at the world as it existed 50 years ago. You have to think about what are the industries going forward. And that's going to be the really difficult challenge for Tanzania. Some countries have been more successful in, thinking about how they can move towards a more dynamic service sector. And Namibia, for instance, is already 70% of its labor force is in the service sector, even though it's a natural resource economy. They recognize that export-led manufacturing growth had some big advantages. It brought together export-generated jobs, learning, export revenues. So it did many things at one time. Going forward, countries like Tanzania will have to have a multi-pronged strategy where different industries, including agriculture, agriculture is an important sector which I think has been neglected. You can increase enormous gap in productivity in African agriculture compared to the rest of the world. And if you were to ask what would make a difference in moving people out of poverty, increasing productivity in agriculture would be certainly towards the head of the list. And there are many ways in which it was done. In fact, government policies with respect to improving productivity of agriculture was one of the most important early, you might call it, industrial policies in the United States. In 1863, the government created the state land-grant universities that in the 19th century, agriculture was as important in the United States as it is in Tanzania today. It was actually more than 70% were engaged in agriculture. And so it wanted to make sure that there was research on research on agriculture, and the benefits of that research went to every farmer in the country. And it set up an extension service to bring the technology, the new technologies in agriculture, to every farmer in the country. So that was an industrial policy, an agricultural industrial policy, but it wasn't manufacturing. Nationals come to the United States because they have particular technologies. So they bring technology. They bring often access to markets because they're linked to particular markets, and that can be important. In a country where there's a scarcity of capital, they can also bring capital. The problem is one has to, that's what they're interested in. They're not interested, you know, they may use words and say, you know, we're a partner, we want to promote development. And they may have that. I mean, let me say, I don't want to be too negative, but their primary objective is making money. So the goal of the government has to be, how do you channel that, their interest in making money with your development objectives. And that's where it's important to have the right regulatory framework to sort of direct their energies and complementary activities of the government sector. But it really takes a strong regulatory framework to direct their action to make sure that they're not exploiting the country, but to make sure that their energies are directed in the right way. That's you know, particularly clear in the case of natural resources. The objective of a mining company is to pay Tanzania, and this is true in every other country, as little as possible, to get as much resources for as little. And your objective is to get as much money as possible from them, and to make sure that they treat the environment well and create jobs and do training and other things like that. Well, that there is this conflict of interest. It's not a bad thing. It's just a reality that you're dealing with. It's like gravity. You know, you may wish that there was less gravity and you feel lighter, but there's nothing you can do about gravity. This is the nature of the reality. So the question is, how do you live with it? So and how have other countries channeled this the best? So in making sure you get the most revenue from the natural resources, having transparent and well-designed auctions, to make sure you have as much competition among all the firms to get the prices up, and make sure they're not colluding with each other. So that's not, make sure they're not coordinating in the wrong way. So secondly, to have as much well-designed contracts. If you don't have well-designed contracts, when circumstances change, one side or the other will feel that they're being cheated. So you have to have well-designed contracts. And that goes, by the way, also to the issue of the private-public partnerships that Kaushik talked about. From the private sector point of view, the ideal public-private partnership is where the government takes the risks and the private sector gets the profits. But you have to design partnerships where there's a better, fairer treatment of the two. But in terms of natural resources, some countries have designed good auctions. Some countries have designed good contracts. An important part of that process is transparency. Again, like I mentioned in my talk, an important role for media. The media making sure that asking questions, why are we getting less money for this than some other country is getting? So the media can play a very important role, and this is where the right to know laws that I talked about before become very, very important. There are cases, important cases in the past, where governments have signed bad contracts, and the country is getting an unfair share. And the question is, what do you do about it then? And it seems to me that the way to do that is to renegotiate the contract. And one of the interesting mechanisms for renegotiation is, you know, there are always ways in which you can extract more. You have to understand that the reputation is important. Even the United States, at one point, levied a windfall profits tax when the profits in the oil got too high. So there are many instruments that one can use. One should do it, I think, within the rule of law, but within a renegotiation framework. Israel found itself in a situation where it discovered that one of its gas contracts was an important one, was totally unfair to Israel. It was with an American company, so it had a certain delicacy because the United States exercised a lot of influence there. So, and the ambassador tried to put pressure. But what they did was very clever. They created a commission headed by a very distinguished economist, Eitan Shishinsky, and he went around the world and looked at all the contracts and the amount of revenues that the government was getting out of natural resource contracts. And when the evidence was presented that they were getting too low by a large amount, it put such pressure that there was a renegotiation of the contract. Australia also was moving in that direction under a particular government, and then there was a change in government. But this is one of the things that was said in the very beginning about natural resource countries. They're often rich countries with poor people, rich in resources, but the people are very poor. And therefore, it's really important that Tanzania get the full value of the resources, and that those resources then be used for the development. Now, one other aspect of this that is important, and again is sensitive, is the transfer of knowledge. And one country that did that really well was Malaysia. They had, this was 50 years ago, they had a lot of oil, didn't have the technology to develop the oil. They had international companies come in and develop the oil, but they made a condition of the companies coming in that they train the people in Malaysia. And the result of that was within a short period of time, they didn't need the foreigners anymore. And Petrobras has now become teaching countries all over the world about oil exploration. So they went from, they succeeded in transferring the technology. So one of the things that has been emphasized here is, as part of industrial policies, there should be more effort made to engage in what you might call the value-added activities linked to the natural resources. And particularly where transportation costs are high, this can be a part of the comparative advantage of the country. So those are at least a number of examples of where you can manage industrial policy. I know we want to go into... Okay, let me stop there and okay.
I think he was getting impatient with me because I'm not asserting the but I think it's very useful that you explain once again what you meant by at the university about the impact of productivity growth and the employment creating manufacturing industry, the extent to which manufacturing industry can continue to generate employment. Because I think it was misreported in some media, like Professor Stiglitz kind of rubbish of the manufacturing sector, but that was not the point. I think the point, and I want to repeat it here, is that we must pursue multi-pronged approach. Manufacturing itself, given the level of productivity growth, may not necessarily generate the level of employment that our demographic dynamics will demand. I think that was the key issue that take home. Thank you so much. So I think
Is it possible to respond to the Twitter question briefly?
Yes, please.
Let me just give one word on that, if I may. I'll just take on the first question. What is the acceptable level of inequality? at one level, that's a question that we don't have to worry about because we are so far from the acceptable that there's only one direction to go. And here you must realize it's really not, inequality is not something you put the blame on any individual. In fact, in the United States, fortunately, among some super rich people, there is an awareness that even if they give away all their wealth, they'll do very little, that there's something systemically wrong that they are so wealthy. It's good to have some such people speaking out. And there are studies which show that the damage done to mobility, there used to be a view that there's a lot of inequality in the US, but there is a lot of mobility. You can be poor, start poor, and then become very rich. Studies with mega data, big data, and a lot of this done out of Stanford by Professor Chetty.
I hope, Professor Kaushik, you don't include those who do the lottery for mobility. Questions are two. What mechanisms should we use to increase rural effective demand as a way towards a sustainable and inclusive growth? And the second one is, how can the Tanzanian government best decentralize development programs to promote greater public-private dialogue and public-private partnerships on the district and regional levels when it comes to investments for economic growth? So those are the two questions from the Twitter. And now we give it to the floor. We have only about 15 more minutes before, actually 12 minutes.
So in that case, I'll just pre-choose who are going to talk. I'll start with Bella and the neighbor there. I'll go over there, former CAG, Ngowi, and we'll finish there.
Thank you very much, and thanks for three highly stimulating presentations this morning. I'm Bella Bird, I'm the country director for the World Bank here, and I must say, I was interested in the discussion on the Washington Consensus because as a director in the World Bank, I see no consensus in Washington. And I haven't for the whole time I've been there. And I think, Joe, that's probably due in a large part to the influence that you brought, but others too. Those principles that were coined as the Washington Consensus in around 89, 90, I think, have been broken down. Folks, be reassured. And And I think it started with the CDF, the Comprehensive Development Framework, which you were involved in and Donald mentioned. But it's moved beyond there with, Christine Lagarde. I won't talk for Bashwar at the IMF, but Christine Lagarde's espousal of equality principles, the shared prosperity goals of the World Bank. Everything we do now is focused on poverty reduction, shared prosperity. We embrace climate change, social protection, all of that. So be reassured that there is the old consensus. Joe, you did it. Well done. But moving on, I did want to say that the gap that I see that we still haven't really been able to address since that time is this issue of industrial policy. And you've talked a little bit about it, how the East Asian models are not relevant for today in Africa. But I still feel this is where we struggle a bit as the bank, is what's the advice, what's the analysis, what's the advice that we should give to countries that are really seeking to forge a path with industry as part of the overall framework for a diversified economy. But critically within that state market dynamic, and it's particularly relevant in Tanzania. I have 4 countries, I cover 4 countries. One of the other ones is Somalia. And I have the opposite problem in Somalia that I see here in Tanzania, which is Somalia, the state is completely privatized. It's about putting an imprint of the state in a wholly privatized situation. In Tanzania, if I may say with due respect, there's too much state. And the private sector is struggling to grow, and it's about getting there. It's about right sizing and rightly framing the state, the role of the state in the economy here. And I hope we can pick that up this afternoon in the panel discussion. Very quickly, let me move on to a couple of other points. One thing that I was intrigued by, and I think adds so much value, but I'd like to know more about in the Stockholm statement, is this issue of social norms and values and how they can be harnessed within a development context, given the fact that they are unique in every context. I think that's a new frontier. And I also liked, Joe, what you said this morning about voice and freedom. And I think that's very powerful. And again, is a frontier that we can move with. And I wonder if that might be included perhaps in a Dar es Salaam statement, should there be one. Thanks.
Thank you. The mic should move just left to her, and then we'll go there. And the Professor Ngowi and he, I think, will be strict so that we save time. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name's Ian Miles. I'm the Canadian High Commissioner here in Tanzania. Bella touched on my question, which again, this reference to voice, this reference to the importance of civil society and the media for maintaining accountability. I wondered if the panel might talk a little bit more about the relationship between democracy and protection of human rights and sustainable inclusive growth. We can't help but notice some of the countries who have made the most progress, both in terms of growth and poverty reduction, are not necessarily well known for their democratic principles or their human rights principles. So I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on that relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Uto? Although you have countries like Botswana and Mauritius which are doing very well, and they're also doing quite okay in terms of democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ludovic Uto, former retired Controller and Auditor General. I would want to highly congratulate our speakers this morning, and I hope, as Professor Joseph has said, we turn out to be better students than the American President Trump. I have 3 comments to make. The first one is on the Stockholm Statement, which correctly emphasizes on the roles to be played by the 3 key players, that is the market forces, the government, and the community or society. The Stockholm Statement is assuming that these three players are willing partners in achieving the equitable growth and human development. I'm saying so because in order for the three actors to come up with a balanced distribution of roles in bringing about that, and in a situation where one of the three partners seems or feels that it dominates over the others, then how shall we assure that this Stockholm Statement on a balanced role of the three is achieved? That is my first question. My second question specifically goes to Professor Basu. In his presentation, he talked of a leadership vacuum globally. He talked of the importance of inclusive development process. And in the first round of questions, we saw people, there was a question on population growth, which even the chairman commented upon. But I would appreciate for Professor Basu to elaborate to us more on what he meant when he talked of problems of technology and labor market. And specifically, he referred to the labor linking technology. As I'm talking of that because in Tanzania we have a serious problem of unemployment. And in actual fact, creation of employment, we should see that one as an assured means of fighting poverty. Can you please elaborate on that? And my last question is on the guest of honors. If we refer to the guest of honors speech, he said that when he was appointed all wondering as to why Tanzania, so much endowed with the abundant natural resources, why are we where we are today? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Prosper Ngowi from Zumba University and a board member at ESRF in this context. We understand that for equitable growth, really we need distribution and redistribution. And this can take place through fiscal policy and fiscal policy instruments. Now the question is, before we distribute and redistribute, then there should be some level of growth. Now the question is really, how much growth should we have before we start distributing and redistributing in order to avoid really distributing poverty? And at the end of the day, of course, once we distribute then, how do we apportion the distribution across geography, across sectors, in terms of age, in terms of gender? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last one. I think I had already chosen.
Thank you very much. It was indeed a very stimulating presentation. By the way, I'm Hashar Mukhopadhyay, IMF representative here in Tanzania. And thank you, Joe, for reforming the IMF Perhaps that's why that straw man of the Washington consensus is probably just a pile of straw right now. So I have a couple of observations that I want to touch upon. And one of them, is to do that a lot of people have commented upon about the balance between the market, the state, and the community. And so clearly over here, the state has a very important role to play in fostering development. But one thing that I did not hear is investment in state capacity so that it can, in fact, play that role in an effective manner. And here I'm not just talking about, technical capabilities, the kind of technical assistance that development partners, the bank, the fund, all of us provide, but also creating an environment in which the government can actually take the kinds of risks that are needed. There is now literature, Mariana Mazzucata, for instance, writes that many of the things that governments do is in fact take the risks that private sector is unwilling to do. And that's an essential government can play and has played in many countries. So how do you, in many developing countries, have governments play that kind of a role when you're also trying at the same time to deal with corruption? And so that's, that's sort of a balance that you need to strike. And perhaps some of the things that you said about the role of the media and a free press, those are important things that can play. But I'd like to hear your views on that. That's one thing. The other point that I'd like to comment on is the role of labor-saving technologies and demographics, and whether a manufacturing-led, industrialization-led strategy of development is appropriate or not for countries here in sub-Saharan Africa. So in that context, I just say one thing, that in the next 10 years, half of the additions to the labor force are going to come from sub-Saharan Africa. And by 2050, all net additions to the labor force are going to be from sub-Saharan Africa. But what that also means that the markets are going to be here in sub-Saharan Africa. So they will have a lot more power in dictating how the global trading environment works. And will it not be the case that the political economy will dictate that, perhaps the use of those labor-saving technologies cannot be adopted as quickly, and that maybe labor-saving technologies will have to be used much more within Africa before, you can move on to maybe robots replacing individuals. And perhaps, should that happen, I'd like to hear from you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? How does think about that?
Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here so that I give floor to our presenters. There will be more interactive sessions in the afternoon after lunch because there will be panel discussions, and then again we'll have opportunity to ask questions and comment. And I'm glad that the last question that came along will help also for you to reiterate your views about manufacturing in Tanzania and Sub-Saharan Africa, because as I said, you are misquoted in the paper after your lecture at the University of Dar es Salaam. Professor Stiglitz.
Yeah, so what I try to emphasize is that Africa and Tanzania can't follow exactly the same manufacturing export-led growth, precisely because of the magnitude of the population growth, working force, relative, and the increase in productivity in manufacturing. But manufacturing can be a prong of a multi-pronged approach. And it is a prong, you might say, that needs encouragement. because of problems of access to credit, risk-taking. So to me, it ought to be encouraged, but one also needs to recognize that it won't fill the gap that will be needed for successful, inclusive growth. And that other sectors, in particular, the dynamic service sectors and agriculture, can play a very important role in that multi-pronged approach. The political economy is likely to change, but not you might say the political economy of globalization, but it's not going to change easily. And right now we're going through a very difficult time because of the way the United States is attacking the rules. And I wrote, one of my earlier books was called Globalization and Discontents, where I explained that globalization was unfair to the developing countries. And now Trump comes along and says that globalization is unfair to the United States. Of Trump. But an example of that is escalating tariffs. The tariff structures, not just the levels, but the structure of the tariffs were designed to encourage exports of unfinished materials, raw materials, and discourage manufacturing value-added activities in the poorest countries in Africa. It's been very hard to get rid of those in the trade negotiations. So I think it is right that Africa try to undo some of the distortions that have been created by the international agreements. It won't happen just out of the voice of the developing countries. I mean, the point is that many of us have been pointing this out for a long time. China is now the largest economy in the world in PPP, but its voice in restructuring globalization has been very limited. So I don't think Africa can count on that restructuring of the rules of the game. It'll happen, but it'll happen very gradually. And meanwhile, it will be necessary to take policies to counteract some of the distortions that increased state capacity. In the world where everybody was focused on markets, you didn't need state capacity. And that was one of the real critiques of what the Washington Consensus did, because it de-emphasized the role of government, it de-emphasized the role of building up the state capacity. And now we realize you need to develop the capacity of all three actors. Now, that is to say, the community, the state, and increasing the efficiency of the market. And you have to recognize there are huge inefficiencies in the market. Sometimes we sort of worship the market, but even in the most developed countries, if you look at the gap between the productivity of the most efficient firms and the average, it's huge. So there are, even within developed countries, large scope for increasing productivity. But the hardest question that was asked about the importance of these balance between these three groups, the role of the checks and balances that I described before, the importance of the media, and it's only through that sort of absorption of that dialogue, of the results of the consensus that comes out of that dialogue, that you can get the three groups to act in a more cooperative way together. Because it's only through the cooperation of the three groups that you're going to have success. I wanted to mention one more issue, which was the role of demography and the discussion that we had in point 7 about norms going beyond economics into sociology and social psychology and psychology and behavioral economics. One of the instruments that has proven very effective in some countries in reducing fertility is trying to change mindset.
They are part of the labor force that is getting poverty down. A second related issue is about measurement. And I'm sorry to be a bit geeky here, but some of the aspects that are very important to poor people regularly articulated, like having agency or voice, are very difficult to measure. So the World Bank's Voice and Agency report, for example, very recently pointed out the lack of good data on women's agency, or even of good disaggregated data by gender. And that's quite a simple thing. There's studies of how that can be done cost effectively with sample designers that we in our network have worked on and released. But I think that sometimes the information and the statistics that Joe has been mentioning about the percentage of the number of people who are minors, or the number of this, numbers do clarify an issue. And some of the lack of information about agency and some of its gendered or child components makes us a little bit less clear on what the issues are. Finally, in terms of fertility, in measurement we measure unmet need for contraception, which is you're not able to prevent children or to space children, or you finished having your children and you don't want more. So those are the needs of unmet need for contraception. And interestingly, when we study their relationship to multidimensional poverty, they're also not related across a large number of countries, obviously. And so it's also not necessarily a problem of poverty. So it does seem to move, in a sense, segue into Koshik's expertise, but into areas of social norms. An example that Amartya Sen often cites in India is that there were also social movements of women deliberately trying to change norms of households, or the soap operas might be doing some of that. So that would be a little bit of what I said, but I think the first set of interventions that you said of creating employment, of creating voice, of creating, as well as that those will change. It's not just social norms that need to change, but also perhaps women's voice in the family that could be a part of that.
Thank you. I'll put it in three pools, my answer, but I'll begin by your question that you raised, Mr. Chairman, about the fertility and Indira Gandhi. India is actually quite a remarkable story because Indira Gandhi from 1975 to 77 tried draconian measures to bring down population growth, which was phenomenally high in India. It backfired massively. She lost in the elections in a huge way in 1977. People reacted. The surprise is most very old Indians would not know that India's population growth rate has really gone down subsequently. India's population is now growing at about 1.2% per annum. It happened, it's very difficult to say what, that draconian measures did not work. But it's education, persuasion, those things have actually played a huge amount of role. And a good example is another country in our neck of the wood doing very well, Bangladesh, where it's the empowerment of women, it's believed, that it's played a dramatic role. It is where the NGOs were going out, bringing women, giving them greater voice. That has improved a whole lot from population characteristics to life expectancy. Now Bangladeshis have life expectancy 3 years more than Indians. And it's probably something to do with the empowerment of women. And on that, I'm glad that Tanzania has lots of efforts to bring women in, give them greater voice. So hopefully you will see that translate. Let me now go into the questions that were asked, and I'm clustering them a bit together. The social norms, Bella, that you raised, and I actually, I think that's important, that's there in the Stockholm Statement, and that distinguishes it from many of the earlier effort. But the origins of that is the World Bank's own World Development Report that Joe just referred to, Mind, Society and Behavior. When that report was when the decision was being taken to have that report, there was a lot of opposition from even sort of regular economists saying that that's not economics, it's psychology, it's sociology, do you really want to bring it in? And the argument that I used, and I think it worked, is the private sector was using behavioral economics from way before it was being discussed in government and by the development groups. To sell a product, you just don't try to make the product as good as possible, as cheap as possible. You think of where on the shelf you will place so that an 8-year-old kid's eyes will catch and the kid will make such a fuss that the parents will be forced to buy that product. These kinds of strategies were being used by the private sector for a long time. It's understandable. All we were saying is that it's now time for people who are interested in development to use that kind of wisdom that we have a lot. So I'm glad that you find that attractive. And yes, indeed, we want to stress that. Let me cluster together what Bhashar you asked. And there was another question on state capacity and democracy. And I'm putting them all together. The state capacity is extremely important, and democracy is also important. We do know of examples of countries which are non-democratic, but which have grown very well. But you know, they are few and far between. Usually when there is a capture of democracy, it ends up badly. Just sort of wide number of examples around the world. And one particular problem that I want to point to, which happens, and that's even democracies face this challenge, when corruption is widespread in a country, pervasive in a country, and a whole lot of developing countries have to contend with that. That's a problem in India, that's a problem in Brazil, that's a problem in China. If you have draconian control at the top, even if you're serious and want to get rid of corruption, when corruption is all over, a natural instinct of the politician at the top, political leader, is if you can pick anyone and you'll find corruption, you don't begin by picking your friends. You'll be out of power immediately if you do that. So it's a natural instinct, and you'll see it in all countries. You begin to pick the opposition people, the media that is criticizing you, and pick on those corruption. After some time, what happens is, even if it began as a genuine effort to control corruption, it becomes a political instrument for silencing opposition. This happened time and again. It's a very difficult problem to handle, but I think one way out of this is a kind of state capacity where you cut your own power. At times it is important for the powerful leader to cut your own power and create an autonomous body, really empowered like a Supreme Court, that can go after corruption. Indonesia is an example of a country that actually tried that, an autonomous body that is empowered, and once you've empowered it, even the leader does not have power over that. We do need institutions of that kind, and at one level, that's what democracy is about, creating institutions of that kind, which are autonomous, powerful voices, correcting voices, and in the long run, beneficial. And finally, if I can find, which was directed at me, the problems of technology, labor linking technology. What did I mean? I'm just elaborating on what I said. And I think the scope for a country like Tanzania is huge. Today, thanks to one kind of technology development, which is mainly to do with information technology, workers don't have to get an immigration visa to another country to work for that country. You can be here, use the connectivity, and begin to work for another country. This is the way the world is going, and this is something that India, without planning, actually benefited a lot. I mean, into the 80s, if you look at India, widespread poverty and really doing poorly. Then linking up with Silicon Valley really gives a huge boost, and jobs begin to come, and people do this. There is a bit of a backlash as Tanzania, the countries that are coming in late into this, I feel the scope is huge. There's a bit of a backlash in rich countries where they are saying that jobs are going away. I think that's a foolish backlash in rich countries, because once a resource is discovered, it's for us to take advantage of that. And you have to remember that every time some work is sent from one country to another, it's made out to be a labor versus labor problem. What is not realized is that every time this happens, profit goes up in the country that is doing that. So there is a capital versus labor problem as well. And I feel rich countries that try to close the door and do well will do poorly through this. And United States is actually the best example. In the 1980s, when the automobile industry and before that the textile industry was coming under competition from other lands, if United States had closed down its economy and said, we will continue to produce textiles, garments, and automobiles, yes, there would be more people doing that work, but United States would be much poorer. It's taking on the competition, which meant that the United States had to adapt to it. Its automobile industry came under competition from other countries. Textile industry virtually vanished, but Silicon Valley flourished. There were other areas, and the US continued to do well. I feel the rich countries that have an opposition to labor linking technology being used by poor countries will realize that actually you can't do better by closing your door. You have to diversify and do better by other means. So this is an opportunity for a country like Tanzania. There are countries in Africa which are beginning to make huge, take advantage of this technology, and I think that scope is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From Washington consensus, or lack of it, to Stockholm statement, or full tomorrow to Dar es Salaam statement or something. It was a privilege to all of us, I believe, to have an opportunity to listen to the great minds with us here today, and for me it was a singularly most privileged. If I could, I would have extended my term of office so that I can stay here together with them. But thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, Alcara, and Basu for your contributions. And I think this brings to an end this session. I will just ask you to give them a round of applause. And I will pass over to George.
Thank you very much, the panel, for a great job done. The issues of balancing. My stomach was starting to grumble, so I stopped at the right time. So lunch is served. We will have, if we can be back here by 2:30, that'll be wonderful. We're going to have an exciting session this afternoon, and with dynamic moderators and the panelists who are going to be here. As you go to lunch, I think I should finish the story before, food for thought. It was an issue between economists and the mathematicians. So, so for those who are late, I'll start from the beginning. So the 3 economists and 3 mathematicians were going on a trip by train. Before the journey, the mathematicians bought 3 tickets, but the economists only bought 1. The mathematicians were glad their colleagues were going to pay a fine. However, when the conductor was approaching their compartment, all 3 economists went to the nearest toilet. The conductor, noticing that somebody was in the toilet, knocked on the door. In reply, he saw a hand with 1 ticket. He checked it, and the economist saved 2/3 of the ticket price. On the return trip the next day, the mathematicians decided to use the same strategy as the economists. They bought only 1 ticket, and the economists did not buy any tickets at all. When the mathematicians saw the conductor, they hid in the toilet, and when they heard knocking, they handed in the ticket. They did not get it back. Why? The economists took it and went to the other toilet. Enjoy your lunch, please, and we'll see you at 2:30. Be wary of economists, please.